program, but up there at the front, Anti-fascism in the Age of Trump. Pretty contentious topic. I feel like I should start with, what is Platypus? Platypus is a project that began out of the University of Chicago just about 10 years ago now. What we do is we do what we're doing right now. We engage with the community. We have public discussions. We publish monthly a Platypus review, which you can get up there in the front or after the event. And we have reading groups every week. This is something we do internationally. Here at Platypus Santa Cruz specifically, which was started about 4 years ago by Daniel Rudin, who is today our cameraman, a PhD candidate in film and digital media here at Santa Cruz. We do the same thing. We have panel discussions. Last year we had a panel on Marxism and anarchism. And 2 years ago we had a panel, Black Politics and State Violence. So we regularly engage with the community. This is something we strongly believe in. We meet twice a week here on campus. Wednesday at 2:30 in Kresge 348. You can come and talk to us after. And we have a reading group Thursdays at 7 p.m. So today we have 4 lovely speakers who I'll be introducing. We have Mike Rotkin, who is a former editor of Socialist Review magazine. He was the director of the Community Studies Field Study Program until he retired in 2011 from here at UC Santa Cruz. He has been recalled and teaches today in Merrill College. He served 5 times as the Socialist Feminist Mayor of the city of Santa Cruz, and he was rejected for military service during the Vietnam War as a, quote, security risk to the United States. He received his PhD from UCSC in the History of Consciousness Department. Larry Capiero is an organizer for the newly formed Democratic Socialists of America here in Santa Cruz. He has served as the liaison to the California Secretary of State's Office for the Green Party of California in the mid-aughts, and was also the Green Party of California's candidate for Insurance Commissioner in 2006, where he garnered over 270,000 votes statewide. His political activism started in Miami, where he was the chair of the Socialist Party USA branch in Dade County, Florida, in the early 1980s. He is a former newspaper editor for various publications, including the Miami Herald and our very own the Santa Cruz Sentinel. When he is not organizing for social justice, he is a freelance writer, mostly writing software and hardware documentation for various tech firms in Silicon Valley. Keith Mchenry. While at Boston University, Keith began to organize actions in cities on the east coast of the United States against nuclear arms and war. While promoting alternative energy and organic gardening in 1980, he and others started the first Food Not Bombs chapter in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which, again, don't forget, come up here and come and look at the flyers and talk to Keith. I'm sure he'll be happy to show you. In 1988, Mchenry moved to San Francisco, where he started a second Food Not Bombs group. In the following years, Keith was arrested over 100 times. I'm sure nobody in this room can top that. For serving free food in city parks and spent over 500 nights in jail. He faced 25 years to life in prison under the California 3 Strikes Law, but in 1995, Amnesty International and the United Nations Human Rights Commission brought about his release. I have to say, I'm happy so that you're here. He has started Food Not Bombs groups around the world. In 2005, he helped coordinate food relief, as well as shipments of clothing and other supplies to the survivors of Hurricane Katrina. In 2012, he founded the Food Not Bombs Free School, which teaches a summer course covering social issues, community organizing, nonviolent social change, cultural events, and sustainable agriculture. Again, I'm sure he would be very happy to talk to you about that. Professor Bruce Thompson, who is my professor and is also a really great professor here on campus. He is a lecturer in history and literature, has been teaching here since 1991. His principal fields are modern European and Jewish intellectual history. He received his PhD from Stanford University. I am Chris, and I'm the moderator. I study history, and I can also talk about that with you. All right. Putting on a panel discussion takes a lot of time, and so I would like to take a moment for all of those that helped in putting on this panel discussion. Please take a stand. So we have Mikhail, we have Chris, and of course, Daniel. All right. Well, I'll take a seat, and then I'll read the prompt, and we'll begin. The prompt is as follows. Since the Nazi seizure of power 80 years ago, anti-fascism has been integral to left-wing politics. The struggle against fascists and Nazis is morally self-evident, so that political anti-fascism seems to be similarly self-evident. Yet in past periods of history, the politics of anti-fascism was completely different, as was the understanding of what it contributed to leftist politics more generally. Still, certain continuity can be discerned in anti-fascism's retention of anti-capitalist claims. Where does this come from? What was anti-fascism and how has it changed? How do the category and concept of anti-fascism help us to understand both historical and contemporary political realities? What does anti-fascism mean today in the absence of fascism as a mass movement? I'll pass over the microphone. We're looking for the volunteer who would like to go first. All right. One thing I would like to add is think of questions, because we will have a pretty large Q&A.
First, thanks for inviting me. Back here. I think when I was asked to participate in this panel, I was told the topic was fascism and the left. Its title's changed a little, but it's my talk I think is still appropriate for the topic. And I think the real question with respect to fascism and the left is really about the relationship between the left and the liberal or neoliberal state, or the liberals or neoliberals who could be brought into coalition against fascism. And what is that relationship about? And it's definitely a complex question about how the left should relate to the liberal state and to liberals. And so I'm going to bring a historical perspective of this that I think is helpful, but it's not because I'm interested in just like burying you in historical facts, but because I think a historical interpretation will be useful to understanding what our choices are and how we need to be acting given the Trump administration and the stuff going on. So, first of all, what is the liberal state? I'm going to use as my source here Karl Marx from an essay called On the Jewish Question that he wrote in 1842. And it really isn't about Jews. It's really about the nature of the capitalist state and what form it is and what characterizes it and so forth. And what Marx says in that essay is that the capitalist state brings the promise of political freedom to the world in a way that didn't exist in the feudal societies that preceded it and other kinds of societies. And it's political freedom, which we'll understand to be democracy in the sense of your right to vote, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to associate, a criminal justice system that has at least the appearance of some kind of fairness and so forth. And Marx understood not every capitalist state meets all of these ideals, but it pushes in that direction and it defends itself on the basis of those kinds of freedoms. That's the freedom that capitalism brings into the world. Your right to participate as a citizen, your right to justice under the way the system's organized and so forth. So you're not left with a kind of arbitrary power of the earlier systems that existed. But Marx points out that the political freedom that capitalism brings doesn't bring economic and social equality, and it doesn't bring power to exercise that equality in any way. So you get political freedom. People have the right to vote. And we'd all have to admit, in some ways it's being restricted recently by the right and Republicans sort of cutting off people's right to vote and a bunch of other issues. But in the long sweep of things, you look at countries, and what we've seen is an expansion of democracy generally, expansion of the right of women to vote, people of color to vote, the end of slavery, the right of people of color, the Voting Rights Act, which has now been undone by this administration. But these opening up of liberal freedoms of a variety of different kinds. But that state never promises to provide economic equality to people. It leaves the private realm. It's up to you have a relationship to your employer, to the private sector, social equality issues, the kind of neighborhood you live in, the kind of education you get, every good that we can think of in this society. We don't promise that you're going to get equality there. Now, over time, sometimes that political freedom that's granted is used to push into these realms. So every time the state tries to regulate, water, making sure we have clean water, or clean air, or environmental protections, or tries to improve people's right to a fair trial and so forth. All of those are examples of sort of the political state beginning to touch into the economic and social realm. But lots of times you'll have people tell you, this is you can't, people work for me in my factory or in my land. It's mine. It's property. I have a right to do what I want with it. I'll hire the people I want. We have these examples currently of somebody owns a little bakery that says, I don't want to make cakes for gay people for their weddings. Because it's a private right. It's the private sector. The government shouldn't tell me what to do in the economic sphere. It's one thing to regulate how politics and elections take place and how the court system works and people's right to free speech and so forth, but not necessarily the way people make a living, the way people live in their families. That's a private sector. What happens in neighborhoods and away from the sort of rights of the governmental openness that exists. So the left, I think we should define. The left has got a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different views, but I think you can characterize the left as that group that wants to push into that and get equal access, equity, and power, control in the economic and social realm that the bourgeois or capitalist state doesn't believe is necessarily important or that matters. And so leftists disagree about how to do that, how it should happen, what the strategy should be, and so forth. But the general left program is pushing beyond political freedom into economic justice, and in a variety of different ways, and social justice in a variety of kinds of ways. And Marx in that essay of 1842 says, the political freedom that capitalism brings is a great form of progress. It's not the final form of human emancipation. It stops short. And if you go to the French Revolution of 1789, or the French Revolution of 1848, or even the American Revolution, of these variety of things, what you find are a political revolution takes place, the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, fights for political freedoms. They think that they can use that in their own interest in a certain way, but they stop short of economic and social reforms. And the leftists push to try and make those reforms go further. And you see in the French Revolution, the working classes say it's not enough to have political freedom to participate as a citizen. You also have to have access to money, the resources to be able to live, to be able to get the things you need to do that. And the state resists that in some way, in general. Now, fascism is a system that basically is a strong single-party nationalist state, usually controlled by a single leader, but not necessarily in its definition. And there's usually some large capital behind it, but the real political force behind fascism are the very lowest classes of people who are full of dissatisfaction for the way they've been treated. And if they can be mobilized, they can be brought into a movement to actually take on this bourgeois state. And their goal here is not to push into the economic realms of economic fascism, to get into economic freedom or social equality of some kind, but in fact, to dismantle the political freedoms that the state had. So you get Trump, Trump does not have a fascist movement behind him, but he has fascist tendencies, and certainly some fascists support him. But Trump's attempt will be to dismantle the liberal state. Let's get rid of voting rights. How come people have, what's this trial stuff? He feels free to tweet about it in the middle of the case as the president about what the outcome should be before the case is even held, and so forth. He doesn't believe in the criminal justice system. He doesn't believe in any of the mechanisms of the political state, and wants to see those undone, which of course leads to a form of autocracy and complete control by the state without the freedoms that give at least the political freedoms that exist. Well, Marx's argument, if you take it to the current day, is in effect, we should be finding a way to use the political freedoms that we have to organize against the fascist tendencies, to organize for positive things and also against fascist tendencies. This state is an important tool in doing political organizing work. Now, there are many on the left who also think in order to get to the economic and social equality that we're after, the control of working people over these institutions and resources in society, the political freedom of the state is kind of an illusion. It's not that helpful. We really go around it or under it or just ignore it or something because we care enough about this political economic equality and stuff. We ought to be fighting for it. And it's just that the state is kind of an illusion of freedom and stuff because it doesn't really touch your personal life. Every 4 years you get to vote. In some cases you find yourself with more access to the criminal justice system in a way that's positive. But the reality is for most people, the state's kind of an illusion and not that helpful. Really direct opposition to Marx's view. And the view is the political state is something we ought to, it's just not that important. We shouldn't care that much about it. We ought to let it go. So you come to the current day with these kinds of definitions that I've been talking about. And before you get that, let me just quickly say, this idea of Marx is from 1842. It finds root in Lenin, when the Tsar has a little a fake legislature called the Duma back in the, just before between 1905 and 1917. Lenin urges the socialist movement at that point, communists and socialists, to get involved in this electoral struggle over the Duma. He says, it's bullshit on one level, but another, it's an opportunity for organizing. As long as they have an election, let's get out there and start talking. Let's use the political freedom we have. It's not much in the czar state, but there's some for a moment. Let's go take advantage of it. The Communist Party in the United States in the 1930s says, we ought to form an alliance with members of the, with capitalists if necessary, certainly with the people, the liberals that are defending the capitalist state. We need to form an alliance with them to make sure that we can defeat fascism, because that's going to be terrible. It's not only we're not going to have economic and social equality, we're not even going to have political freedom. So in that struggle, the Communist Party actually took the position in the middle of World War II for the support of a no-strike clause, because the strike would hurt American industry and that would hurt the war effort against Germany and Italy and Japan. So historically, communists have often found themselves in situations where they were willing to work with liberals to fight a fascist menace that were quite serious and challenging on some level. And that's my argument, that basically we need to find a way to work with liberals and others, even though our target's going to be fascism to try and stop Trump's successes. We cannot afford, as it's tempting, let's say some of the people who've been active in the streets of the United States recently, to hell with free speech and other people's free speech. Let's kick in. Nobody can speak on campus if they have views we don't agree with. I'm going to make the argument in my last 10 seconds here or something that we really need to find a way to work with allies to stop this tendency of the right to develop. And doing that means that we need to work on defending these so-called bourgeois liberties, the freedom to vote, the freedom of speech, and those are important. And they make a real difference to us in our ability to organize and get into the economic and social struggles that we need to be involved in. And if I had more time and maybe in questions, I'll come back and suggest some of the things we can be doing to actually take on the fascist tendencies. But I think we have to do that in alliance with liberals, not writing them off and just saying, oh, freedom of speech is bullshit, it's just, it doesn't really mean anything. It means a huge amount to organizers that want to go out and change the world around the economic and social issues that the left ought to be caring about.
Okay. Can I just quickly screen this?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry. Somebody place first. Any person that knows how this place works. My phone?
Okay, well, I remember when I was a kid, I was a baseball fan, and there was a hearing in Washington, the Kefauver Committee, and they were interested in whether the antitrust laws should apply to baseball. And first they had Casey Stengel, the manager of the New York Yankees. Should the antitrust laws apply to baseball? And Casey Stengel gave a wonderful answer, and it went on for 30 minutes. And then they asked Mickey Mantle, the great star center fielder of the New York Yankees, Mr. Mantle, do you think that the antitrust laws should apply to baseball? And he said, I agree with everything Mr. Stengel just said. And I would love to say that I agree with everything Mr. Rotkin just said. That was quite brilliant. So I would like to do something a bit different, which is to talk about anti-fascism historically, in the more immediate sense, tying it to the period of classical fascism. So if we go back to the 1920s and 1930s, what we find is that anti-fascism began almost immediately, not surprisingly, and that the first great anti-fascist was a member of the Italian parliament, it was a man named Matteotti, who pointed out that without the liberties that Mike just talked about, without the so-called bourgeois liberties, without freedom of the press and freedom of speech and freedom of association and the right to vote, so on and so forth, you could not possibly have a decent politics. Mussolini's thugs murdered him. So right at the very beginning of Mussolini's regime, this is 1924, Mussolini came to power in 1922, we start with a political murder. Anti-fascism was dangerous in that period, and that is why so many of the great anti-fascist writers, intellectuals, activists, were at one point or another, they went into exile. But sometimes that didn't save them. So for example, in the Italian case, another great anti-fascist figure was a man named Carlo Rosselli. He went into exile because he'd seen what happened to Matteotti. He went to Paris. He was in France. He was the founder of a group called Justice and Liberty. And again, the same point. You cannot have a decent politics without the core values that go back deep in the history of Western civilization, certainly to the French Revolution. You can't have a decent politics, a decent society, without justice and liberty. Mussolini's thugs crossed the border into France and they assassinated him as well, and his brother. That's the beginning of anti-fascism. In other words, it was a moral critique. And what it did was to insist that fascism was, among other things, a betrayal of the central core values of Western civilization. And we can see that in the document that I projected on the screen. This one comes from 1934. This is from a German writer by the name of Ernst Toller. He committed suicide in 1939 in New York in despair. But here's a great example of classical anti-fascism. This time it's applied to the German case, and it's in the form of an open letter to Joseph Goebbels, his henchman, his minister of propaganda. So if we look at that together, when on the 10th of May 1933 the works of German writers, philosophers, and scientists were thrown onto the funeral pyre, you, Herr Goebbels, protected and welcomed this barbaric act. In a speech you named the burned works of those men who represent a more noble Germany than you, intellectual garbage. You have burned the works of German publishing houses, theaters, bookstores, libraries, and schools. You persecute their authors, lock them up, drive them from their native country. You're driving out the best teachers from the German universities, the conductors and composers from the concert halls, the painters, architects, and sculptors from their studios and academies. So I won't read the whole thing, but perhaps just one or two more sentences. You claim to save German culture, and you destroy the purest work of German culture. You claim to save German children, and you poison their hearts with the defaming slogans like stupid nationalism and racism. And finally, you speak so often of heroism. Where have you shown it? We too are familiar with heroism, the heroism of work, of character, of the principled individual who stands by his ideas. So that's classical anti-fascism. That's an example of how it started. It wasn't necessarily connected, it didn't necessarily emphasize the collusion between the fascists and the capitalist elites of the period, although of course that was a major theme for those who were Marxists. But what it did was to emphasize how important those core values of Western civilization are. Without them, again, no decent politics. And the extent to which fascism, in claiming that it stood for a kind of heroic community, was in fact the antithesis of a decent society, and again, because it violated those core values. So we get a period in which the greatest writers, Thomas Mann, George Orwell, Ignazio Saloni from Italy, the greatest writers came together in a common critique, whether they were Marxists or liberals or whatever. Thomas Mann was actually a conservative, a common critique that was based on those core values, and what they did was to show the extent to which fascism and National Socialism betrayed those values and therefore betrayed everything that's good and decent in our society. So, classical anti-fascism was, in the first place, a moral critique. 2 minutes. And the very finest writers of that period were, from their different perspectives, were all contributing to that very powerful moral critique. And what I would suggest is that one of the things that's necessary today in the era of Donald Trump is to start from that kind of critique. Here is someone whose slogan is "Make America Great Again," just to start by pointing out the extent to which Trump's bullying, his racism, his disrespect for the freedom of the press, for the independence of the judiciary, for the importance of voting rights. All of these things are, in the first place, these are betrayals. He is betraying core American values, obviously, and hasn't the slightest idea of what it is to make America great and what that would entail. I think that's the starting point. The economic analysis of the recent tax bill horror, for example, that is obviously crucial as well. But I would begin with a moral critique. This is not making America great again. This is a betrayal of everything that we understand as crucial to what is best in our political tradition. Okay.
Hear all these work. I'll reach all the way up to the It might be under your stuff on the chair. Oh, no,
I think so.
is it long enough? Sometimes it's, oh, thank you.
When Daniel asked me to come and speak today,
Okay, sorry about that. Start over again. Is that my voice? There's my voice, okay.
when Daniel asked me to come and speak today on this panel, I asked, well, because he had Mike here on the panel as well. Mike, as you may or may not know, has a long history with the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, the New American Movement, which is now DSA. Whether it would be somewhat redundant that both of us would be on the panel. So Daniel said, no, why don't you talk a little bit about what's going on now with DSA and sort of the socialists in Santa Cruz, now. With that said, I'm going to actually just concentrate on the last question on the sheet, which is what does anti-fascism mean today in the absence of fascism as a mass movement? Basically the potential elements of fascist society exists now in America. It's a lot more subtle than, brown shirts marching up and down the street and things along those lines. Although there is some pockets of violence, as we go forward. But the potential is there for a fascist society, and we have to actually keep an eye on that. And Mike actually outlined most of this. Dr. Lawrence Britt has a 14 defining characteristics of fascism, and forgive me if I put on my Captain Obvious cape, because I know most of you already know this. But when you go down the list of all the characteristics, you'll find that many of them are pretty much prevalent here in the United States, either leading up to Trump's election or, am I still on here?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, because I can't tell. I'm sorry. Yeah, microphones are new to me. So in the 14 defining characteristics, essentially what you have, I wrote them down, which is because I couldn't remember them all. Powerful nationalism, check. A disdain for human rights, check. Identification of enemies and scapegoats. Anyone? Just throw them out there. I'm sorry?
Muslims.
Muslims, okay. Gays. Okay, there's a long list of those. Rampant sexism, check. Controlled mass media. Having been in the mass media, I can say that that can be like a partial check, and there are some people who are still doing investigative journalism. Not as many as I would like, obviously, but there are some pockets of resistance in there. But that gets mostly a check. Obsession with national security, that's a check. Religion and government intertwined, that's going to be a yes. Corporate power is protected at 9 and 10. Corporate power is protected and labor power is suppressed. Okay, those sort of go hand in hand. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Okay, that's a check. Obsession with crime and punishment. That's a check. Especially when the president may have, jeopardized the case against this fellow who ran over all the folks in New York. Rampant cronyism and corruption. That's a check. And last but not least, and certainly not least, is fraudulent elections, which also gets a check. So I should mention that DSA in Santa Cruz is actually new. It's just been restarted since January, and we've got about 80 members countywide. And one of our main pillars, one of our main actions is anti-fascism. DSA nationally and DSA locally are working on a united front against fascism, which means that we're working with a lot of different organizations. And that breaks down into 4 different basic sort of sections. Organizing in self-defense and solidarity with the most vulnerable communities. Developing a rapid response team to mobilize members and actions. Organizing around economic justice without compromising on racism, which has happened in the past among liberal pockets, and resisting the white supremacy by protesting events wherever they occur. And that's kind of manifested itself nationwide as far as our organization goes through a lot of the actions recently in Charlottesville, in the Bay Area, excuse me, the Bay Area itself, where our local sent a lot of people up to Berkeley. A lot of folks from Tampa and Central Florida went up to the University of Florida to protest Richard Spencer's talk, which didn't go so well for him there, thankfully. And in concert with other actions that people have organized, different organizations have organized, DSA has been there to offer support and offer folks and things like that. One of the things that we concentrate on, or one of the things that is kind of important to the whole movement, is countering the mainstream narrative. The mainstream narrative is that, excuse me, like fascism is a white supremacy. White supremacy is like poor white people, working class whites, and when you look at, if you follow the money, it's really not. It really comes from above, and a lot of fighting that comes. A lot of the fight for that comes from letters to the editor, just making that known, call-ins on radio shows and things along those lines. We put out actually a very good manual on anti-fascism. We meaning the National DSA. It's about 20 pages long. I don't have it with me, but you're welcome to email DSA, the local DSA at info@dsasantacruz.org, and that'll come to me, and I'll get you a copy of that. But it's a pretty comprehensive manual on what to do about fighting fascism in the area, and it's something that we're doing nationwide. Each chapter has one of these, and when I say each chapter, we're in actually 48 states. Actually, I think we're lacking in Delaware and one of the Dakotas. I can't think of which one. I think it's south, because I think there's a chapter in North Dakota. Anyway, we have a duty, sort of, here to prevail in this fight against anti-fascism. And I want to thank Mike for bringing up a lot of issues there are a lot of items that I didn't have to bring up, because again, Mike has been a pretty good soldier in the fight for socialism in this area. And I just wanted to say, with the 2 minutes left, you are all familiar with Martin Niemöller's poem about first they came for the communists, and then at the end of the poem he mentions that nobody came for me, nobody spoke up for me, and because nobody spoke up for anybody else. But anyway, first they came for the communists, or first they came for the socialists, depending on the version that you're reading. And basically, I think the Reverend Niemöller put socialists and communists first, because we're the front line of anti-fascism, and that's something that I think we should keep in mind going forward. And I want to thank Mike too for, and I agree with his argument that the argument he made earlier. So that's my argument too. So
Okay, wow. Okay, well, I'm Keith, and I'm one of the people that helped found Food Not Bombs. And my first book, I actually had Martin Niemöller's poem from that he wrote after he was released from Dachau is the front of my book, and that was in 1992. So, So I think that's been a really important message, that if we don't resist, that there will be no one left to speak for us. And I think right now we're in a, you could probably draw a lot of parallels to the events of now and the threat of fascism, but it's also fascism and its connection to society today is like much more, maybe more complex. And so when in Santa Cruz, I've been sharing free food every Saturday and Sunday at the post office, and there's this effort to dehumanize the people living on the streets of Santa Cruz. And in fact, it's nationwide. I've been following stories in Burlington, Vermont, where they're trying to drive homeless people out of town, and there's the official, the local media, mainstream media, has very derogatory terms attacking people, including their most famous unhoused person, a young man, or not that young, but a middle-aged man who's schizophrenic, that they call a transient, but he's got 180 arrests, and he's like got hundreds of tickets, and he's been getting in trouble on church streets for over 10 years. And transient really is like when you're moving through someplace. It's a term that you're the other. You're not from here. But obviously that young man is from there because he's got a over 10-year history of interactions with the authorities, and he can't get help, and it's really a failure of society to support this person. But to create the image of the other, that's really been the tactic. And so I see this intersection, sadly, between the rhetoric of people like Trump and his people and the whole alt-right movement and this what is obviously not even hidden aspect of fascism, of racism, of misogyny, of worship of violence, of this worship of the police and so on. That's all one thing that's everybody, I think, that many Americans can see that is wrong, that must be resisted, that's there's an air to the marches in Charlottesville and so on of brown shirts during in the Nazi era. There's the goofiness and lack of just total I've acquaintances that who grew up in Germany at the time of National Socialism and compared to how stupid Trump is and no one taking him seriously, and it's similar to how stupid Hitler was, no one taking him seriously. So we can see a lot of parallels like that. But what frightens me maybe more is the good people like the good people here in Santa Cruz who think nothing of maligning economically disadvantaged people. So they to call them vermin and use many of the same terms that the German population used against the mentally ill and the homeless, and in the run up to Hitler taking power and to the period through which he was in power. And so that really concerns me, and that the fact that the far right has such a huge impact and influence and is and taken over much of the most important reins of national government, and is really frightening. But it seems like it's making it possible for liberals to move their efforts further to the right under cover of this what is obviously naked fascism, and that I find really tragic. Rather than people pulling together to see that potentially the policies that, if implemented by the Trump administration and by the far right-wing Congress and who are being accused of not being far right-wing enough by people that are declaring themselves as fascists, likely to lead to even more chaos in society and many, many more people ending up falling through the cracks, ending up homeless, ending up in desperate poverty. And an alliance, as Mike was talking about, would be, is like more of an emergency at this point rather than something, certainly it is really important to protect free speech and to protect the institutions that exist today. And the fact that that people like Trump are able to just like discount, due process and things of that as being just frivolous, and that we all should be going for becoming billionaires, is outrageous. But we need to unite on a great many more fronts and not fall into this like we're better than them type of thing, or to and to confront this really harsh attitudes against people on the margins. And sadly, for instance, here we in Santa Cruz, our city council has voted to continually votes to criminalize the people living on the streets. Won't even have voted most recently to continue a law against sleeping outside between the hours of 11 at night and 8:30 in the morning, and to protect that. So I do a lot of Public Records Act requests, and I read the comments. Like if there's an article about homeless or so on in this Sentinel, it's unbelievable the cruelty. And if we allow that kind of language and cruelty and dehumanization of people at that level, and it's possible then to intern them, maybe put them in work camps. I hear really nice people say, well, what they really need is you could get all the people living on the streets, put them in a work camp. That would be really good. And that did not go so well for the homeless that were rounded up in the 30s and put into a work camp. And I've been very interested in this a lot. The fact that Trump's language and the alt-right's language and everything, and the hatred of people living on the streets is a canary in the coal mine, so to speak. That's my fear. And if it's okay to intern the homeless, then who will be next? And that poem, I think, really, really strikes at the heart. So these homeless people in this photograph were rounded up and put in Dachau at the same time that Martin Niemöller was in Dachau, at the same exact time. And I don't know ultimately what happened to these particular homeless people, but they were, the two triangles put together, the yellow triangles put together, they made the Star of David for people that were rounded up that were of Jewish background. They had the one triangle, the black one for the homeless people, they had the brown one for the gypsies. They had different codes for people put into the concentration camps. And as we now know from history, millions and millions of Jews were executed. But the beginning of that was the roundup of the antisocial people, the homeless people, the drug addicts, the gay, the people that were living on the streets. And so I see that attitude here in the local media and in the laws that are passed, creating a quality of life laws against people living on the streets, this whole attitude. So I think that it's important to definitely resist the overt fascism that we see of the Trump administration and of the alt-right, but I think it's also very important to point out the dehumanization and the criminalization that goes on in society of people of color. That's why my flyer because Niemöller had made a number of poems where he switched out the names of who came first and we did not speak out. I think he had something like 26 poems. So I felt the liberty that we start out with homeless and Mexicans and Muslims and then us. And I think this is like Dudley's serious right now, and so I encourage people to resist.
Thank you, everyone, for your opening statements. We'd like to perhaps focus a little bit on some of the topics in the prompt. You guys touched upon the encroachment of fascism today. And Mike and Bruce, I remember specifically saying we need to start with a moral response. And one of the questions I have is, how does this response look? And how does the Berkeley example play into a moral response? That this clearly was a tactical response, some would say violent response. Maybe you guys can touch upon that a little bit more.
Yeah.
I think part of the problem in modern American politics is a tendency for people to be only able to do like one thing at a time. And the idea that things are complex, that you have to work in a number of different areas, often escapes people. I think we also have a tendency to, I think it applies to all of us, myself included, a tendency towards kind of a moralistic politics, this desire to sort of express ourselves clearly what we think, rather than a strategic politics to think what will actually build a movement against fascism, for example, or that will actually successfully allow us to sort of push the liberal state into more economic reform and issues of equality. And so if you're given a choice and you say, well, what should we do about this, and you can only pick one thing, it starts to look like you will be very hard to be effective thinking about, if we're only going to do this one thing and that's all we can do, I think we're in trouble. So just really quickly, my sense is we need to be working as leftists in 3 areas. And I'll be really quick about 2 of them that don't relate to the topic today. One of them is about grassroots organizing and the need to go out. People in the United States have been demobilized. They used to be part of what I would call democratic institutions, whether even churches, where people planned church socials together, build a new building and stuff. And now you go into a drive-in theater in Southern California to church on Sunday, and you put the money in a basket as you leave. You never talk to another human being. There's no social connection. Political parties more and more are not something where you meet with people. You just vote there. You go to the voting booth and you vote for that party, but you don't relate to other human beings. You go through all these institutions of daily life that have gone. So I think the left needs to begin working on, in workplaces and in neighborhoods, where Santa Cruz would be an example of this, to begin thinking about how we can actually mobilize people. And this will often be some of these disaffected people that have an attraction to Trump's quick and easy false solutions to the problems that they're confronting. And I don't think we'll ever really be successful at stopping that kind of politics if we don't offer people some alternative that actually begins to transform their lives for them personally, not just some abstract politics about the world at large. So that's one area I think we need to do work in. It's not easy it takes a long time, it's a difficult struggle, it doesn't happen overnight, often years to build a successful neighborhood group or a workplace union or something like that, but it's critical work. It's also kind of, I think, critical that we do education about an alternative to the capitalist world, that people understand you can organize an economy differently than everybody dreams to be a Donald Trump someday, or the rich is a Donald Trump someday. And so I think we have political work to do. Well, what is socialism, and what would economic and political reform look like, and how would it be organized? I don't think we have an answer to that very good. I mean, DSA doesn't, nobody else does. This is the way socialism should look in America. I don't think we even have a vision of what it might vaguely look like. It would be more equal. Working people would have more control over the decisions being made. But how would you structure it? Would you have state-owned, factories and organizations like that has its problems and issues? Would you have a free market, but there would be certain kinds of ways that workers had rights that would superimpose themselves on the rights of the owner to make them do what they want and so forth? Those questions. But one of these, the third area, that's the one that focuses directly on this issue, is we need to be taking on the fact that our state is going in the wrong direction right now. It is a moral crisis for us, and to be strategic about that it's not as if we, for a long time we could be under the illusion that things are getting better all the time. We're extending rights to new groups, more people get to vote, we're having more equality, the middle class is getting larger, that the poverty is being addressed in some way that it didn't used to be before the 60s, and we're starting to change things for the better. I think it's hard to look at the United States right now and think that. It looks to me like on every front, things are moving in the wrong direction, moving backward. And so I do think we have to be engaged in that struggle, even though we have to be doing direct organizing work, and that's difficult, takes time and effort. And why, even though we really have to be involved in trying to educate people about what an alternative economy might look like, and how it would work, and how it would be more freedom than the system we have now, not less freedom than the one we have now. I think a lot of our energy right now, and it's critical that it happen quickly, go into the struggle against the alt-right, against the kind of stuff that Trump's doing. So these large marches that we held, there's March for Science, the Women's March in DC, and here in lots of towns across the United States. Those are mass movements that involve the left working with liberals. A lot of the people in those marches, they're not leftists. They don't have they're not thinking about economic equality and freedom and stuff like that. They're focused on the scientists that think it's outrageous that people don't believe in facts anymore or whatever. Fine. Those are our allies against what's going on right now. We need to help organize that and build it. It doesn't organize itself. It takes the work of leftists along with others, and often we're forced into leadership positions on this to actually get things going. So when something like happens at Berkeley, we need to be there. But I think, again, just to be clear how we define those politics, it shouldn't be to shut down some right-wing speaker that's going to go on campus. It should be a much more subtle politics that expresses outrage at it, that shows that there's a lot more of us than there are of them, that attacks the argument, but that doesn't say, this person doesn't have a right to speech, because that eventually starts to undermine the notion that we have the right to speech, and ultimately we're going to suffer for that. So that's my point of view here, that this is the fight against these fascist tendencies. It's not a fascist movement yet, but against these fascist tendencies in our president and the people the 30% of voters that support him, we need to be taking that on directly.
One of the things that's really disheartening is the hollowing out of the opposition party, the Democratic Party. And one of the things that the two periods, the fascist period, our period, have in common, the widespread sense that democracy wasn't working, parliamentary government wasn't working, liberal institutions weren't working to meet the real needs of people who were suffering from mass unemployment. That's something that links the two periods, the sense that democracy wasn't working. How do we revitalize our democracy and, more specifically, our Democratic Party? Take, for example, the case of Michigan. Michigan voted for Trump. That was unbelievable to me. How is it possible that a state built around the auto industry, which the Republicans were willing to, after the financial crisis in 2008, let it go, let it slide away, condemned Obama because he bailed them out? How is it possible that that state went to Trump? What's going on with our democracy and more specifically our Democratic Party if they're not even able to remind people that the Republican Party was willing to let the auto industry collapse completely? The Democratic Party saved it. President Obama and his administration saved it, and yet Michigan went for Trump. Unbelievable. Part of the reason, of course, is voter suppression. That's a huge factor, and revitalizing our democracy means, among other things, taking on that tremendous juggernaut, gerrymandering, voter suppression, all the rest of the dirty tricks that the Republicans have used to subvert our democracy. Those things are huge.
Doesn't have to always be in the same order, but whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, you don't have to.
You don't have to.
You can do rock, paper, scissors. Okay. What Mike said. No, just kidding. Pretty much, yeah, what Mike said. But I would like, and Bruce too, but I wanted to sort of embellish a couple, or sort of touch on a couple things going forward. First of all, DSA is a pretty large, we have a big tent. We have a very wide spectrum of political views in the organization. Bruce actually touched on a very interesting point. I think one of the part of the blame in the fact that the Democratic Party is in such shambles has to do with the last presidential campaign, and I kind of hope that that's something that gets sorted out. As you know, systematically, the Democratic National Committee has been sort of jettisoning progressives and those further left in the party, and that doesn't really speak well for the rest for that party. And the problem there is not so much that the Democratic Party is not left enough or is not a perfect vehicle for change, but in the United States we're kind of hamstrung with having just two parties. As the former liaison to the Secretary of State for California for the Green Party, I know pretty much how much it would take to create a third party in this state. All the states are different, so they're going to be different in different states as far as the requirements go. However, in California, it's pretty rigid, and in a lot of other states it is. So there's a conundrum there because forming a third party is going to be very difficult. Working within the Democratic Party is becoming increasingly difficult. So, there's we're kind of at a tipping point here when it comes to that. So, anyway, I just wanted to touch on that. And we were talking about morality, I guess, was probably the original question of the protests in Berkeley. Is that what?
Whether or not violence is,
Whether or
how does
not-
that play in?
Okay. I was kind of hoping that I could go before Bruce because he's got the historical perspective on this, and I don't. But it would be interesting to discuss. Well, let's see. How can I put this in a tactful way? Thanks, Robert. If more Nazis were punched, this is a hypothetical. If more Nazis were punched in the 30s in Germany, whether things would be different. There's a lot of speculation. I don't know what the resistance to the. I'm not that steeped in history well enough to know what the resistance was in the 30s in Germany, but it's an interesting, I guess, exercise. So, and I don't have an answer to that. I think again, as an organization, DSA again is a very big tent. You have some people who are lining up to punch Nazis, and you have people who are being pacifistic and not. So I fall somewhere in between. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Keith.
Yeah, well, there's been a bunch of, there's a certain amount of news articles that show that. In fact, I read a couple of stories where people in Antifa who were out fighting Nazis were also did food out bombs and other community work and so on. And that's definitely true. But I'm very fearful of suppression of free speech and the use of attacking people coming to speak about anything to try to just shut them down and to stop them from speaking. And I think that is really outrageous. And there's because I think that the people that will be most affected will be people that have an alternative voice, voice that people that we have. And so I think the logic that is being promoted amongst communities thinking that punching Nazis or attacking them on this, stopping them from speaking at colleges and so on, is that is going to be that's a challenge for activists to counter, because it is very fearful that if they come to power in even greater extent, and if our rights are eroded even more. And so you could see from a person's point of view that it's, that, oh my God, we've got to do whatever it takes but to stop fascism. But I don't think that that's actually a very effective strategy and a very effective way of doing it. And ultimately, is exactly what fascists want, because then it gives them publicity. It also, because for fascists, having a police state is ultimately a really positive thing. And if you're going to be trying to shut down alternative, like obviously very despicable speech, to go out and fight those people physically and is to stop them from speaking is crazy. Now, on the other hand, self-defense against people going out and threatening to kill people and stuff, that there's a certain logic to that. So it's a really complex issue, but I think what's happened is, instead of like being just, okay, if a bunch of Nazis come in helmets and torches and start beating people of color, people with differences up on the streets, and then defending people from that's, there is a certain clear logic, but it gets really fuzzy when you start to go out and attack Nazis, at free speech events and so on, and equate it with self-defense where you're protecting, let's say, like what happened with in Charlottesville, where Antifa, ringed the church and kept Nazis from coming and beating people up at a church. So it's I think it's certainly a major question that must be discussed right now, and I think shutting down free speech though is incredibly dangerous, and that we will be the principal victims of that in the end. So that's my perspective.
I want to push more on one part, and then we'll open up to questions. Now, if not everyone wants to respond to this, there's no problem with that. There's no specific order. We're talking here, it seems to be unanimous here that we work with the liberals to create a leftist movement. Now, I think this is similar to Marx and the 1848 movement, where you have your ally. But then I think the question is, at what point does the ugly revolution come? Or is that ugly revolution on the horizon? Does one lose sight of the ultimate goal, which for many anti-fascists is socialism?
Try and make clear my earlier point about working on different levels. I don't think we'll ever get to socialism if all we ever do is, vote for the lesser of evils, do our best to stop the right from destroying the freedoms that do exist or taking them back and so forth. I think we have to do political organizing work, and I think we have to do education about the alternatives and begin working on them. I didn't think I'd find myself quoting Mao Zedong in this talk, but Mao says the most important question for this exact quote, the most important question for a revolutionary is what time is it? And if you think we're on the verge of a revolution and we're in a place where the state has failed, the liberal state, it's not working, and the choice comes down to, are we going to be a fascist society or are we going to be a socialist society? Maybe you've reached that point where revolution is ripe and the masses are ready to rise up and overthrow the government and institute whether they do it through an electoral process or whether it's done through a violent process. That's one issue. But I would say anybody that thinks we're in a revolutionary moment or even period or close to it or it's going to be right around the corner is not paying attention. Because we're not in a situation where we have the luxury of thinking, gosh, are we close to changing from the political freedoms of capitalism to the economic and social equality that socialists would like to have? We're a long way from it. So you have to work on those long-term projects. You don't ignore them because you're busy trying to fight fascism, but you do have to take on fascism at the same time. And doing that work, it aligns you with liberals, and that's the same thing that the Communist Party found in the 1930s. You don't just like, okay, we're working with liberals to stop Nazi Germany and Italy and Japan, but does that mean that you don't do political organizing work and talk to people about a different way of organizing society? No, you have to do two things at the same time. It's like walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's not easy to do that, but it's what has to happen. So I don't make an argument that the fight against fascism means we ought to give up on our struggle for socialism, but I don't think we're ready for a violent transformation to socialism right now. We're in a very backward period where we'd be doing well to get ourselves back to where we were 5 years ago. And that's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to require allies. We will not do it as the left. There are too few of us, and if we don't align with the liberals on this effort, the right's going to be more successful, not less so.
Yeah, we need to do a lot more actually reaching, mainstream America about these ideas, because I think that the mainstream media and so on, and all the noise out there is such that there is really no background for changing society in a dramatic way. And I think that if there was like the Revolutionary Communist Party was, promoting or suggesting a civil war last Saturday, and the alt-right really loved that, and the capitalist media like somehow conflated the Revolutionary Communist Party with anarchists and who would never, marginally work together. In reality, it's like there's so much dumbing down, sadly, of the American people, and so much confusion now with the ability of mass media and hijacking of social media and all that we really have maybe a couple of generations of, if we are able to live that long as a human race, to educate people enough to think outside the box. I mean, it is a possibility at the same time that maybe because of all this mass communications and stuff, some ideas that are logical become something that all Americans actually have heard about. So that potentially could happen, but it doesn't seem at this point really likely. But that's something that we, if we want to defend our, any kind of sanity, that we need to look into and figure out how to do. And that's actually just one of the reasons Food Not Bomb stands out on a street corner with a bunch of food and literature, is to talk to the people and introduce them to these ideas that they otherwise would never get to encounter. And so, trying to meet people one-on-one on the streets and really talk to them, that's like important. And when it's millions of Americans, that's a lot of people to talk to.
Just very briefly, I would just say that if the resistance to Trump and Trumpism becomes associated with violence, that's not just a dead end, that's a catastrophe. That's, let's remember that it was the association between violent street protests, Democratic Convention, 1968, whatever, that gave us Nixon. Nixon would not have been elected without that. And similarly really with Reagan. To go down that road is to condemn the resistance to irrelevance. It just won't work in American society if the resistance becomes violent. The best tradition is the Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy tradition from the 60s. That's what we have to build on, and certainly not any kind of violent tactics.
Thank you. I would like to open up the floor to questions now. Oh, sorry. The next time we'll get a wireless microphone.
We'll make it work.
Yeah, it's kind of fun.
I'm make this short, so it's not going to, you don't really need to keep time. I agree with everything that was said to the votes appropriately to my left. I just wanted to add too that, and Keith touched on it a little bit. Mike said we're nowhere near, we're nowhere near, and he's right. Keith said that we may not have time. He's right there too, because I think we're in a kind of a bit of a crunch, especially at an environmental level, where the environment with climate change and things along those lines put us in a hard position where we don't have the same kind of time that we would have had historically, where we may not have decades, we may have less than that. So that's just one of the things that, well, personally motivates me to sort of step up my game. And I just wanted to bring that up too, because it's something to consider when thinking about your activism. So that's all I'd like to say on that. Thanks.
All right. So I'm going to open up the questions. I see Daniel's hand first, but after Daniel, anybody who has a big disagreement, I would like to take your question first, just for fun, right? So in the pink.
Yeah.
And then Daniel, right?
So wait, first or second?
You can go first.
Okay, sure, yeah. So I'm sure we talked a lot about forming coalition with liberals, and I'm sure you're familiar with the position in the early 1930s of the Comintern, which was to avoid coalition with social democrats. And so my question was basically, liberals have specific ideals as regards political practice, and those ideals are nonviolent and primarily electoral in terms of their strategy. So my question is, how can we formulate an anti-fascist political practice without it involving capitulation or accommodation to liberal political demands?
Well, again, my position is that if we have my vision of a future socialist society, I don't know what it will look like, how it will be structured, but there will be political freedoms in that society. It's not going to be run by the state or a party that's going to, with our best interests in mind and deciding for us how our lives ought to be lived. So the model that we get out of the Russian Revolution and that of the Chinese Revolution and many others, not a particularly great model for me thinking about how it's going to get organized. So I have no problem working with liberals to defend the political freedoms that they're interested in. You're right, that's where they stop. Like I said, they stop at the political freedoms. They don't necessarily believe there should be economic equality or power by working people over the institutions where they work and live. So they're going to stop there. I don't have to stop there. I can go on doing other work in that area, but on the political issues, I agree with them. I will defend those institutions. I'd like to see us as a socialist society have those institutions, free speech, freedom of the press, right to organize opposition parties, all that stuff. So I don't see a contradiction for me in trying to work with them on those issues, but I will openly and directly confront them that their vision stops short of where it needs to go around these economic and social equity issues. And we have to fight with them. So in a good coalition, you work together on the things you can agree on, and we agree that they're important. And it's not a fake coalition. We're lying to you, we don't really give a shit about what you care about, but we're going to use it to get to you, and then we're going to use it as a mechanism to share our ideas. No, I want to work with them honestly on defending political freedom, but I want to also push them. And there are practical ways to do that, because liberals are often caught in contradiction. Many liberals who only believe in political freedom also are outraged at the idea that Trump got rid of all the meat inspectors. I don't know if you guys are aware of that little thing. But, we need meat inspection. It's a form of, oppression to the capitalist class on some level. But the idea that the government has the right to look at the meat and make sure that it's actually edible or secure. And so I think in good faith you can work with them in coalition on the political freedom issues and then push them and be honest about your views that that world that they see, that the best of all worlds would be the U.S. Constitution properly enforced. No, it's not enough for me, because there's nothing in the U.S. Constitution about economic equity. And so there's nothing. and you have to push that on them and go beyond it. So that's my view about that issue.
Yeah, well, I am concerned about liberals and their threat, actually, sadly, to freedom and democracy, and because of their capitalism and corporate power is often more important than actual freedom and democracy. And I think that we see that through the last presidential election. That a great many well-meaning Americans were didn't either were not educated, didn't have information about it, but that it's more important to maintain the economic system than it is to go forward with what would be considered a traditionally Democratic Party platform of being for the working people and for those kinds of things. And another thing that really frightens me and related to liberal, I think we have to actually try to work with, that they're the most likely allies because the left is really tiny. So you have to kind of work with these people. And in some kind of coalition, so I agree with that, but I think it also is, I would not be surprised that ultimately, to me, a lot of the anti-Trump stuff that we see is essentially fronts for the DNC to maintain some power in the political system with the idea of promoting more of the same kinds of policies like NAFTA and like WTO and stuff. And I think the most frightening thing is Obama's NDAA, where he signed a law late in New Year's Eve, which makes it possible for Trump to round up any single person in the United States and hold them permanently without trial, without ability to communicate with their lawyers or with anybody. And it's in the Obama administration, it was already a confrontation as to how many people were rounded up under the NDAA under Obama. And can you imagine Obama handed that power to Trump, and that was what we were saying was so bad about Obama, because right, Obama might not do it, but Trump will take that law and use it against the people.
Just a word in defense of American liberalism. Let's remember that it's not just about voting rights and freedom of the press and the courts and independent judiciary, all of those things, which are extremely important. But look, American liberalism gave us the New Deal. It gave us Social Security. It gave us Medicare. And yet, senior citizens vote in overwhelmingly large numbers for the Republicans. What's going on here? Why can't we make the case that without liberalism, we wouldn't have those things? You wouldn't have a decent standard of living if you're a senior citizen. And take infrastructure, for example. Liberals stand for infrastructure spending. We're not going to get infrastructure spending from Trump. He just cut the hell out of the budget. You cannot have a major infrastructure program if you're going to give tax breaks to the rich and the corporations. And this is so obvious, but the point doesn't seem to get through. Liberalism stands for, among other things, Social Security, Medicare, infrastructure spending. Those are things that can make a difference, have made a huge difference in people's lives, and we shouldn't let them forget it.
Several things to mention and not having them in order. Okay. Again, I agree with everyone to my appropriate left. We have this debate often in the SA where whether liberalism goes far enough or whether it doesn't. Again, I think it's right to say that, well, these are stepping stones to a greater good. So despite the fact indivisible may drive me personally nuts, and a lot of the quote resistance unquote, it seems to be just armchair activism. I think it's necessary to sort of like engage, as Mike mentioned. And Bruce is right about liberalism's contributions, and those should not be ignored, but they can be enhanced, in a big way. In each case, and I wanted to mention infrastructure too, because the other day I was speaking to one of the students here on campus who's forming the YDSA chapter here, and there is a YDSA chapter here. For those of you who are interested. Okay. And he asked me we were talking about different socialisms, and I identify as a sewer socialist, and that means that, not that I necessarily go underground and walk around the big tubes underneath the ground, but it's sort of a socialism that emphasizes good, clean local government, infrastructure that works, because essentially you can't have a revolution unless your toilets work. So I must be out of time.
So I've got Daniel, then with purple glove, and then
Joey.
okay. So you three.
I might have to leave soon though, but it's okay.
Okay. Yeah. In the since we're facing a time crunch, we can direct the questions to just one or two of the speakers, so we don't all have to answer. Okay, Daniel.
So I wanted to direct the question towards Mike and the formula of pushing beyond political freedom to economic freedom. And so I guess my question is, has to do with this other point of historical freedom. And so if you do in fact push beyond political to economic freedom, what happens there? What is the outcome? And specifically is what happens to civil society and the relationship between the state and civil society? And thinking back to the New Deal, right, and the Democratic Party's role in holding together the New Deal coalition, you could think about the ways in which the state actually did impinge upon this larger question of historical freedom, did prevent a larger historical possibilities from happening. One could also think about the list that you gave, Larry, about the checklist, right, in terms of talking about fascism. Under the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, certainly you had sexism, you had racism. You had a whole bunch of the characteristics of fascism. So I guess the question is pushing beyond political freedom to economic freedom a return to the New Deal or the social welfare state, number one? And number two, do we even think that the Democrats are even going to, even if that model were viable, are the Democrats ever going to want to chart some sort of return to the social welfare state after a good 30 years of neoliberalism? Why should we expect the Democratic Party to do that?
So there's a difference between a social your point, there's a difference between a social welfare state, even at its best, what the New Deal produces, and what socialism might look like. Because, first of all, the New Deal was definitely limited politically. For example, the right to organize was not given to farm workers in the New Deal, because the Dixiecrats in the South didn't support it, and Roosevelt couldn't put together enough of a coalition to actually, he was interested in it, but he couldn't make it happen. So they ended up being excluded from the National Labor Relations Act until, the 1970s, when the farm workers union starts getting organized. There's a lot of problems with even that legal state. And my point is, in order to accept the idea that working on these ideas of expanding the jobs programs and better stuff for seniors, a healthcare, a single-payer healthcare system, or even a governmental one, literally socialized medicine, where the government provides you with the healthcare, whatever method you use, those would all be pushing beyond the current arrangements. But that's not where I see, that doesn't define socialism or where we need to be going. I'm looking for a reorganization of how decisions are made in workplaces fundamentally. And that was never addressed in the New Deal, was never brought, and you can look at the New Deal as having two possible, going in two directions. Roosevelt's concern was, he faced the possibility that there might have been more of a socialist revolution in the time, given what was going on in the world and in the United States. And so you can judge, he saved, as people often say, he saved capitalism, by his reforms that he made happen. But you can also look at the left in the United States in the 1930s and look at, they were in no position to really take over the society. They were, they might have been, a much larger percentage of the population than they are now, which they were, but it still was never even like a third, much less the majority of the population. So it wasn't as if the choice was there. Oh, let's ignore Roosevelt and the stuff he's doing. Let's push for a revolution right now and make it happen. But the political parties made a decision that wouldn't have been a wise move, and I think they were right. I think they would have gotten their asses kicked if they tried to actually have a revolution and not support. And were not for the left, you would not have had Social Security. You would not have had the reforms under Roosevelt. He did them, but it was a lot of pressure from the Communist Party and the Socialist Party and other left groups, and generally left liberals who were already into the economic freedoms along with the political. Not every liberal absolutely draws the line at the edge of political freedom. A lot of them believe in economic reforms and labor unions and pushing stuff in a further direction. So I think that you basically, I don't want to end up saying my goal would be, let's get back to the good old days in the 1930s when we had Roosevelt, a coalition that was building, at least moving in the right direction and doing a lot of reforms. That was a good thing, but it's not the socialism I envision by a long shot, because it doesn't include democratic control by working people over the institutions of their daily life, where they go to work, their neighborhoods, even their local government.
Does anybody else want to respond?
I like what he said.
Yeah, I'd like to direct my question to Platypus. I'm seeing all panelists, white, middle-aged, men, middle-aged / older white males. No people of color, no women, and that's disheartening, and I'd like to understand that.
Right. It's a good question. I've had this question asked before. Platypus as a bigger group, well, obviously there's no discrimination or anything like this. You bring up a good question. Maybe we do need to reevaluate how we choose our speakers. As far as the process to choosing speakers, it's whoever's qualified. I mean, we ask a whole host of speakers, and if they respond, they respond. But
I do know they invited one woman to speak, we turned them down because she called me, decided not to participate for whatever reason. But I have no affiliation with Platypus, so I'm not defending them because I'm a member or whatever. They at least made some attempt. I don't know who else they invited.
right, I actually was not involved in the invitation process. I mean, would anybody in Platypus like to respond to that?
I can. I mean,
Okay.
just talking to Hans, Chris over here, the Platypus moderator here, he's Latino.
Right.
We have people of color in the crowd, and we have males and females in the crowd, and we never ever said that we deny anybody for any reason. As a matter of fact, I post on social media and I handed out the flyers myself, and I always said everyone is welcome. That was the only sentence I wrote.
I'm talking about the panelists. So.
I mean, it's just kind of how it worked out. It took a lot of work for us to put this together, and the people who responded, and that's what we came up with.
But you make a good point. And in fact, we can speak after, and we can talk about this because you have a great point. And thank you for bringing that up.
You can suggest people. You can suggest people.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe you know somebody.
Yeah. If you would know anybody who would be willing to tell us the panel, please let us know.
Right. Any other questions? In the back, and then yeah.
Oh, cool. I'll take it at Mike, I guess. Yeah. I was just wondering more if you could elaborate on the practice of how the left might channel the energies of anti-fascism beyond just retaining liberal freedoms and moving on to those greater freedoms you talked about with Marx.
Okay, well, it may not, I didn't make that. When they asked me how I wanted to be introduced, I added that line about having been security risk to the United States in the 60s, which is true. I turned in my student deferment, I didn't believe in it, and I got drafted. drafted and went off to my draft board, and when I got there, I passed out sabotage pamphlets, and they didn't take me. I've also been arrested, I can't meet Keith's record, but I've been arrested about 30 times in demonstrations. I'm not against taking strong principled stands and civil disobedience, confronting people directly. I certainly believe in the right of self-defense that Keith talked about. But my view is that you can't be, it's not like I would just sort of send a letter to Berkeley or something. I think people, if there's a demonstration that you can get to where there's going to be some people coming, I think there need to be counter demonstrations, large ones. I think we need to make clear that there are more of us than there are of them. I think we need to have leaflets that pass out our message and critique what they're saying, what we know they're going to say in that meeting, and so forth. So I'm not about doing this sort of all at universities and passively and whatever. I think you have to get your bodies on the line sometimes. But I don't believe in attacking those speakers or telling them they don't have a right to speak here or something. I want them to have a right to speak. I want to be able to critique their speech with a better response than they've had. So I'm not about being passive about this at all. I just stop short of the line of like, let's go beat, there's more of us than them, let's beat them up. No, let's just demonstrate that there are more of us than them, and let's send a message out there about what's wrong with their message, and actually use our brains to like critique the shit they're putting out, because it deserves a critique for sure.
Yeah, so the guy in the white shirt.
Yeah, so my question was, how can you reconcile kind of anti-fascism with the left, since a lot of fascist figures in like history, like Hitler and Mussolini, did have their political roots in like socialism and kind of towards leftist ideologies?
Yeah, somebody with, I have my opinion, but somebody that's a historian should say something about that.
Well, one of the features of classic fascism was that it mixed anti-capitalist, pseudo-socialist and pseudo-populist slogans, rhetoric, with pro-capitalist actions. And in other words, from the beginning, what was striking to the original anti-fascist writers was this peculiar mix of left and right. But the left part of it was always fraudulent. Hitler's socialism, that's really a joke. Mussolini started as a socialist, but that was never authentic. So I wouldn't, it's just not an issue now because Trump doesn't claim. Well, Trump is a pseudo-populist, and that has to be exposed. But certainly he doesn't have any socialist rhetoric, or it's a different ballgame today.
I would point out that one of the first things that happened with like Hitler and Mussolini was that the actual real organizers on the left were killed. So shows you how left the Hitler and them were. That I say, even with the Bolsheviks coming to power, people that were very radical left were often killed. That's even though they have like more of a somewhat authentic idea of the state running stuff.
It's worth noting that these guys were not socialists in any significant meaning of what that word would actually be. The reason they, in Germany, found it attractive to think of themselves as the National Socialist Party, you have to remember the German Social Democratic Party was the largest single party in Germany at the time. The largest. Not a little group of whatever. It was the largest, the Socialist Party of Germany was the largest party there. And with their trade union affiliates and everybody else, they represented probably close to a majority, which is one of the tragedies of fascism, that they represented probably almost a majority of the society in some way. And so the term socialism, unlike here where it's a nasty word to call the S word or something, maybe a little less since Obama's been attacked by it so many times. He's not a socialist, but attacked for it. But there, socialism was very popular. A lot of people supported it and stuff. And so as a word, it had none of the negative connotations that we think of here. They thought of it as the state and the institutions of daycare centers and all the wonderful stuff that the German state was trying to provide for people, and they got just demobilized after World War I. So I don't think they ever were really socialist in any significant meaning of that term, even though they use the term National Socialism. It has nothing to do with socialism as any less of a standard.
I don't need it.
Yeah, last two questions, lady in second, and then Mikhail, and then if we have time, because we got 10 minutes
Since we have a
left.
crowd of younger people, I thought I'd introduce something that could be a good organizing tool. Mike has referenced several times. A new way of viewing our social organization other than capitalism. And I mean, that's a very big topic, but there's a freight train well underway, and I've read estimates in the last couple of months that in the next 15 to 20 years, and you guys are going to be affected by it much more than me, we're going to lose 30 to 50% of the jobs in this country to automation. And today there was a program on NPR about attorneys specifically. It's not just those angry white factory workers who lost their good GM jobs. It's all levels. I mean, I read a New Yorker article within the last year that about 80% of the medical procedures could be done by robots. I mean, there'll still be a job but there'll be fewer needs. We need more doctors. So it's not like they're all black and white. They're complex issues. You have to know something, to really speak about these things. But that is something that, since it's going to cut across, CPAs, anything to do with numbers, those are another prime. It's not just the working class anymore. And that's something that you could bring people together to talk about, and you guys are really going to be affected. You're going to train for jobs that are going to be, obsolete, are going to be just gone for some reason. So, and it doesn't really get mentioned much. Next to the environmental stuff, it is because we are not passive in America. We get pissed off, we get armed, we get angry, we do drugs, we shoot each other. We're not, we're not those polite Brits, or, where we don't just queue up and wait for our rations. We act out. So we're dangerous, we are dangerous. And so, I mean, it's just a very big issue that's going to really slice the whole society up really rapidly. There'll be many more people homeless, many more, as they cannot afford already an insane housing crisis.
It's absolutely right. It's a huge issue, a huge question for the future. We should also remember that what Trumpism is a combination of authoritarianism and pseudo-populism. And somehow he was able to make the case to an alarmingly large number of working class people that he would be effective in fighting for them. In other words, he would be the one who would provide jobs. And
Which was all lies.
all lies, right? But
Maybe he doesn't actually believe in anything.
well, that's true too.
Or he believes in Trump. That's
He certainly believes in Trump. But that is clearly so important, so crucial that infrastructure is one of those things where they can't outsource infrastructure. They can outsource medical evaluations, but they can't outsource infrastructure. And who really is going to fight for that and provide that? It's not going to be the guy who's cutting taxes by $5 trillion. Again, I don't know. It's hard for me to understand why that point is not effective.
Why was this first thing of infrastructure program to put people to work? Because that was what he really ran on.
Yeah, and forget it. It's not going to happen.
In my moments of despair, and there are plenty of them these days, I remember the following fact. Trump did not actually win the popular vote in this election. I'm not going to challenge that he won it by the mechanisms, for all the manipulations that can happen. But in the end, Trump was elected by 70,000 people in 3 counties in each of 3 states. That's how he won the Electoral College. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio. And on the basis of those 70,000 people make the difference. And given the manipulation of gerrymandering and the suppression of the vote and other kinds of stuff, We shouldn't be walking around thinking like, why is everybody in America crazy and stupid and insane? It's a much smaller group of people. It's significant. You can't ignore it. We need to take it on where it's going on. But let's not imagine that somehow we're in this total minority and everybody else loves Donald Trump. It is far from it. He's supported by 30% of the vote of it, and they watch Fox News, and that's all they watch. They live in that bubble, and it's a real serious problem. But it's not as bad as if somehow we'd won the popular vote. That would have been a much more difficult thing to confront, because then you're thinking people really are idiots, and there's no hope, and what can you do? So I'm a little more optimistic when I keep that fact in mind. We have a lot of work to do, but this can be overcome. This is not the end of the world because he won this election. It was a bunch of stuff that came together. And then we have to look a lot more into the details of how that went wrong, and the Russian stuff is not irrelevant to that, the social media stuff that happened. So I have a lot of optimism that we can win this back if we work on it, not just depressed about how horrible it's going to be because, my God, this guy won. It's depressing that he won, but it's not the end of the world.
All right, so the last question, and please don't leave right away. And I'm sorry I can't get to your question. We can all talk after. Mikhail.
So I'm actually very happy that you went first, and thank you for giving me the last question. I was watching the Steve Bannon and Charlie Rose interview, where he was detailing how he won the election and he was going to charge Trump and he was telling people that. And what he specifically said was when Hillary Clinton started playing, well, when Hillary Clinton took out Bernie Sanders was when he knew he had a chance of winning. But when Hillary Clinton doubled down on playing identity politics, and when the mass media, including Fox News, tried to destroy him, which they really actually tried to do to a degree.
Fox News tried to destroy him.
Not Fox News, but MSNBC and a few others, without question, they were very much against him. That actually played to his hand. And the reason for that is he said the tactics that they use, things like locker room talk and sexism and blah blah blah. He says that those issues people do care about, but they don't affect them as much as the fact that these people haven't been working for years in this part of town. So they're willing to tolerate it. They don't care. I mean, you had other presidents who were vulgar as well. And I think that was a tactic that went wrong. So going forward, I like what you said a lot about violence never being the answer, that violence being catastrophic. I also like what you said, that we should have, rallies that counter. Yeah. So if we are able to find a way to control the rallies and never get violent, that would be perfect. That's my question. So, what sort of a new strategy do you see going forward so that we don't repeat the same mistakes as we did when we actually got elected? And number two, I really like your idea about changing the economic system so that different decisions are made. And a good place to start with would be democracy at work.
A really quick answer. I won 6 elections in Santa Cruz, and the first thing I learned was you get to save and go to all these forums. I went to 19 forums in my first election, and there were 19 candidates. Imagine how long a forum would take. You have to go down. Everybody had to say 3 minutes, then follow whatever. I learned that you basically have to figure out what the points are that you want to get across to an audience, and you stick to those points. And I will say that when the Democratic Party, I'm not, the political correctness issue and stuff. I think it is a question how people speak and changing the way we talk about each other and the jokes we tell and all that stuff. They do matter. But it's a big mistake when the party gives up its central message, which is about working people and about jobs and trying to change this economy and infrastructure and the stuff that the Democrats actually probably would want to work on if they were in power. And you give up that stuff to talk about what kind of bathrooms people are going to get access to. I mean, I think there should be access to everybody, the bathroom they need to use and whatever. I'm not saying that's an irrelevant point, but I wouldn't use 3 minutes in a speech to talk about it. I talk about what I think is on the voters' minds and really matters to them, rather than what's a pretty abstruse issue to them and not really relevant to them. And the Democrats, I think Trump hit on something really big when he realized how many people are kind of just pissed off at this political correctness about stuff, and that becomes the debates and the issues, and you can see people talking about that when they should have been talking about, there's only 89,000 coal miners in America. 89,000 coal miners. Trump's talking about them like they're half of America or something, and there's nothing he can do to save their jobs. The jobs are going away no matter what, because coal's now more expensive than other alternative energies, and it doesn't matter. The Democrats got off of their main train, and we should not let that happen again in future elections. That is stupid. We have to figure out what's our message, let's stick to it, and not be diverted into what for the voting population, it's not of great interest.
We don't have time for concluding remarks. Does anyone want?
Some of us will stay after, we'll talk to you again.
Okay. Yeah, so that's an important point. Please ask questions after. We do meet tomorrow. Platypus does Kresge 348 at 2:30 p.m. for a coffee break. We do this every week. Please come and talk to Keith about food not bombs. I mean, you guys see him downtown. Now you can talk to him. This is the man. He's been arrested 100 times. Come on. So, thank you for coming. Please keep Platypus in mind, and thank you. And give it to our speakers.